G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and this is a special video because the pub test is now officially 1 year old. Yes, we've hit that first anniversary. And the fact it's still here is all thanks to you. Tuning in, watching, sharing comments, offering suggestions, it all has been greatly appreciated, and let's see what the next 12 months brings. But getting down to business, this video is a little bit different. Because I'm comparing the two most notorious, or well-known I should say, non-captured serial perpetrators. Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. What can we learn from looking at both of these? Are they similar or different? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now, I honestly have to say this video was going to be way different because I was actually looking at Jack the Ripper and Ted Bundy, also a very well-known serial perpetrator. And the comments that Ted Bundy made about his motives, his method of operations and all that, and then comparing him back to the Whitechapel killer. But I realised that was going to be wrong because, well, not only is Ted Bundy a complete lowlife, all the things he said after he got caught was just to inflate his own tyres, make himself look smarter and better than he actually is. So I realised we really got to take everything he said with a grain of salt. So then I sat back and thought, well, who else could we look at? And the obvious one being the Zodiac Killer. Now, this is not a deep dive into that particular individual. I will be touching on it, and there is plans in the work of actually doing a Zodiac series as well. But the point to this one is analysing if there are similarities, and therefore would that perhaps change our perception of Jack the Ripper himself. And I have to state right now that some of my personal views have been challenged. Many of you who watch this channel would know that I still am not sure if one single perpetrator committed all the crimes in Whitechapel. But after analysing the Zodiac, I started to question that. And you might ask why. Well, let's look at that first one, the method of operation. The MO, as people generally call it. Now, Polly Nichols and Elizabeth Stride, their attack was very similar. There was no major mutilation done to their bodies, like no parts removed. So I could think, and I was thinking, and going to make a strong case for the fact that they were done by the same person, but different to the person who attacked Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, whose crimes were very, very similar. And then Mary Kelly is in a whole nother basket again. And I've covered videos talking about how Mary Kelly may not be necessarily a Jack the Ripper victim, but in isolation, her crime makes a lot more sense. Yet, I have had to reconsider now, after looking at the Zodiac. Now, the Zodiac operated in the San Francisco area, and he was taunting the SFPD, the San Francisco Police Department, and his confirmed official attacks occurred late 1968 to well into 1969. But his first attack occurred on December 20th, 1968, where David Faraday and Betty Jensen were shot and killed in their car. And they were in an area known as Lover's Lane. I think we get the idea of what was going on there. And that crime remained unsolved. And then around midnight of July 4th or early morning July 5th, 1969, Michael Mageau, and Darlene Ferrin were also shot in a different lover's lane inside of a car. Now, it's important to note the last couple were only 17 and 16 years old. These two were 19 and 22, and Darlene Ferrin actually does play a central part in most people's thoughts on this particular crime spree. But Michael survived the attack, and Darlene, she passed away. But now this is when someone claiming to be the perpetrator of these crimes started to send letters into the police. And on September the 27th, 1969, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were stabbed. They were 20 and 22. And like the previous attack, Brian survived this stabbing, but Cecilia, she lost her life. And then only a couple of weeks later, on October the 11th, 1969, Paul Stein, who was 29 years old, was shot. And he passed away. So within the space of just under 12 months, 4 attacks happened, 5 lives were lost. But the crimes weren't exactly the same. So here's a bloke going from shooting to stabbing and then back to shooting. Now, I know people say that just doesn't happen. Well, it's accepted fact that this was the same perpetrator of these events. So when I look back at Jack the Ripper, I then wonder, well, could all of those crimes actually been perpetrated by the same person? We assume that Jack the Ripper was interrupted when he was in Dutfield's yard attacking Elizabeth Stride, and that's why he didn't perform extra surgery. But it's actually possible that that was just what he did in that moment. He had no further plan to do anything more. But when we look at, say, Polly Nichols and Elizabeth Stride, the location probably determined what the crime was going to be. And it wasn't going to be the full mutilation that could be done in other areas, because in Bucks Row, anyone could have walked past at any time. In Dutfield's yard, the same. That was an entryway into the Working Men's Club. But when you get down to Hanbury Street at the back of 29, you're way more secluded, and also Mitre Square, it was a very dark spot, which would have allowed the perpetrator that extra time to perform the crimes that he wanted to. And then obviously with Mary Kelly, you're inside a locked room, so you've got all night. And so when we take the Zodiac and see how he altered his MO, well, it's likely, in my mind, that a single perpetrator back in Whitechapel very well could have altered his method of operation depending on the circumstance that he was in. Now, I'm not saying it's convinced me that my view that it was not the one perpetrator, but yeah, it's made me stop and think very, very closely about my personal view. But then we get on to the motive. Now, is there a similar motive? Well, because the Zodiac has not been caught officially, the case is still open, as I understand. People have made claims recently that DNA testing proved it was somebody, but we've had similar claims within Jack the Ripper circles about people saying DNA's proven it, and it's not accepted by authorities. And as I understand, now correct me if I'm wrong in comments, but as I understand, the Zodiac case is still open and unsolved. Now, I won't be mentioning suspects here, but the police believe they thought they knew who the bloke was back in the day. But I would suggest from where most of the crimes happened and how they occurred in these Lovers Lane areas. Like 3 of the attacks were couples. None of the women survived any of these attacks. Now, because 2 blokes did survive, some sketches could be made. They could identify the person to some degree. And so we're fairly sure, I'd say 99.9% sure that it was a male who did these crimes. And therefore I'd be suggesting that maybe he felt slighted. Maybe he wasn't so good at talking to the women folk. Maybe he'd even propositioned a couple of these and then he was going to show them. That's speculation, but it does seem to stack up. And that is often the motive for these serial perpetrators. They're feeling slighted in some way. They're feeling inferior. And so then they decide to show how smart and how clever they are, and that they're actually better than what people think. I could see that applying very much so to Jack the Ripper as well. See, back in the day, it had to be some madman, some arsenic-addled person, maybe someone with a communicable disease that's sending them mental. You know, that is often what people assume when they see these crimes. They also wanted to believe that it couldn't have been an Englishman, had to have been a foreigner, all these immigrants coming in. Now, we get that. But how many people who get caught doing these horrendous things, and it's just the person next door, that some of them have got families, they're working jobs. I mean, people think they might be a bit quirky, but they don't think they could have committed these crimes. They're going, you're kidding, it was him? Like the Yorkshire Ripper is a classic example. Ted Bundy, to a certain extent, is the same as well. No one really thought that a fairly decent-looking bloke could be capable of committing these crimes. Like, why did he need to? He probably could have had the women he wanted. And so putting the motive of some insane person necessarily onto Jack the Ripper, I don't think does it justice fully. But I'll be diving into that a little bit further in this video, and I'll be asking the question, who is the real person? Like the Dr. Jekyll or the Mr. Hyde? And I'm not talking Richard Mansfield here, the actor, but I'll be putting forth a little bit of information that came my way recently, a little bit of research on the psychology of these perpetrators. Now, I'm no psychologist, but I think you'll find that very interesting. But interestingly, there was another massive similarity to Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac, and that is the letters. Now, I know most people say that all of the Jack the Ripper letters were hoaxes. After looking at the Zodiac, it's made me re-question something else, and that is the Dear Boss letter. That particular letter gave the name to Jack the Ripper, but that was held back from the public until after the double event. And it's said that the police then released it because in that letter it was suggesting cutting off someone's ear, and Catherine Eddowes had part of her ear cut off, and so they then said, well, we'll get it out in the public and maybe somebody will recognize the handwriting. But I'm sort of suggesting that there could be more to that particular story, and particularly why they put that letter out into the public. Was there a bit of extra information that the police had but were still withholding? I think so. Because the injury done to Catherine Eddowes did not match exactly what was in the letter. But now, if a press person with such a great name, Jack the Ripper, had have written that letter to the police, surely they would have wanted that released a lot sooner. Because after the Annie Chapman crime, they were selling papers. But he was known as the Whitechapel Killer and other names, not Jack the Ripper. And as soon as that brand, Jack the Ripper, came out, well, that just added to the public's interest and newspaper sales, and we could go on. So I don't think it was a press person that wrote that particular letter. And I feel that there was something in there, and I don't know what, but out of the hundreds of letters, when the double event happened, the police must have, for some reason, thought it was actually written by the bloke doing this. And the term Dear Boss, I find intriguing, particularly when we look at the Zodiac letters. See, this bloke wrote letters in to the police. I think most of them started that this is the Zodiac speaking or something like that. In some of them he put ciphers and said, if you can crack these, if you can decipher this message, it will reveal who I am. And he was claiming responsibility for the crimes that had been committed already. Well, oddly, they cracked the first one fairly quickly, but it did not give his name. But then he would write more letters and say, if you don't publish these, if they don't make the paper, I'm going to blow up school buses, I'm going to do all sorts of other atrocities. I'm still going to keep committing crimes, but I'm going to do even worse things if I don't get this notoriety. But also in the cipher that got cracked, and it is also backed up in one that's just been recently. So there's 4 ciphers out there. 2 of them have been deciphered, and they both basically have this notion that the Zodiac was doing this so that if you murder someone in this life, that person will become your slave in the afterlife. Now that is a very interesting concept that has been around for thousands of years in Africa, South America, and other places around the world. In fact, it was used particularly in war times because, the more people that you could knock over, the better you're going to be. So even if you got killed in action, well, you'd be right if you took out 10 because you can have 10 servants. Sounds pretty grandiose, doesn't it? Actually, no, it sounds absolutely diabolical. But now that's what the Zodiac was saying, why he was doing the crimes. I actually don't buy that myself, but I'll get onto that very shortly. But I will say it's showing that he wanted control. He wanted to show himself smarter than the police, than the public, and the press. And I see that same attitude, same motive in the Jack the Ripper letters. Dear Boss was mocking the police. If Jack the Ripper wrote the Dear Boss letter, it is so eerily similar, the message being sent. Look how smart I am. You will never catch me. Now, as I've mentioned before, most serial perpetrators seem to have that attitude that they are smarter than everyone else. But now we get on to something. And this is what I think is true of both the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper. That at some part of their life, they were playing a character when they were performing the crimes, or they were acting out when they were back in the family. Now, psychologists say that these serial killers have to have a disconnect in the brain somewhere when they're doing these crimes, that it's not necessarily them doing it. And with these letters, I can see how they're projecting a character onto the page. Now, it's hard to really describe this, but oddly enough, and this is the information that was sent to me saying, writers, people who write fiction tend to have a very similar thing to what these serial perpetrators do. And that got my interest for obvious reasons, being a writer myself. And so I read this article quite closely, firstly with a fair bit of skepticism, saying, no way could this possibly be true. And I find then, well, maybe it is. Now, when I was writing Corporate Jungle, and I won't spoil it, but there's 20 main characters, and throughout the book, parts of it are written from each of those people's perspectives, their point of view. Now, interestingly, when doing that sort of thing, and this is for me, and this is what was explained in this article, it was true. See, some of those characters aren't all that likable, but you're writing from their perspective. So you actually need to become that person. You need to project in to their world. Not necessarily how others are perceiving them, but how they think they're being perceived by others. Because, we sort of think that we know how people view us, and it's often different. It's different to what we believe. And so when you're writing from that perspective, you've got to suspend all other thoughts. So my process would be actually sitting at the computer for 15 minutes, not doing anything, just thinking about that character, and actually eventually getting in to that character's mind. And then I could write from that point of view, not from what other people were thinking about them. And so that's what this article was saying, that these serial people actually can project into a different character. They become this monster. Or they could become, the neighbor next door. And that's why they are so hard to catch. Because if it was a raving madman running around, that would be plainly obvious and the police would pick them up in an instant. We could point to a few that have been discussed as Jack the Ripper suspects. Letchmere is a classic. Lived a regular family life, lived out his life. Robert Donston Stevenson. He came across to many people as quite a nice bloke, very intelligent. Yeah, he was in hospital for pain, that was all. But not a serial madman. George Hutchinson, who was hanging around outside Mary Kelly's place. Even Montague Druitt. Well, now that's also an interesting story, which I think we have to go back into. But you see, all these people, on the surface, you would not think that they could have committed any of these crimes. Yet many people believe that all four of them could have done it. But then we look at the profile, the psychological profiles done by people. I think it's a good foundation, it's a good base to consider, but I don't think that we can match every little detail to someone and say, therefore, it has to be them, because it's like a foundation to a house. Every house is different, so every person is different. So whilst I even see similarities between the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper, there's also a lot of differences as well. But there are some striking similarities to the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper. Firstly, they have 5 officially confirmed victims. They operated in a very short space of time. They had letters sent in taunting the police. Suspects still get mentioned today for the Zodiac as well as Jack the Ripper. Now, the Zodiac claimed that he had 37 victims at least, and many people believe that Jack the Ripper had a lot more as well. Police had a strong suspect back in the day for the Zodiac, and police back in the day had a strong suspect for Jack the Ripper, which I don't think gets too much mention, but I would suggest Francis Tumblety was high on the list. Remembering they wanted to extradite him, but the US government wouldn't have it. And so I will be covering the Zodiac crimes as well, and particularly the ciphers, because I find that interesting, because the next book in the Power of History series that I'm working on actually has a fair bit to do with ciphers. So when I saw that, I'm like, well, now that is quite intriguing. But I have not given up on the Jack the Ripper series. In fact, the next few videos are obviously going to continue down that path. I've got some suspects to cover, as well as some further deep dives into some information. And the funny thing I'm finding is the more I dive into it, the more I'm actually questioning some of my own personal theories. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But let me know what you think of this one down in comments. Do you think I've gone off the deep end, or did you go, you know what, Owen, that had some interesting information in it. Thank you very much. And as mentioned, the pub test is now 1 year old. Let's see what the next 12 months brings us, and I'm only here because of you the viewers. So if you want to, give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.